we are no cowards. We're actually going to play this. Both stories too. But as we all know by now, this is easily the weakest entry in the entire franchise, so for me to bash on it even more is just low-hanging fruit nowadays. Instead, let's really see why it doesn't work when compared to the first game. Maybe we can figure out some key differences that make or break an action game. Because going from such a genre-defining game with one to such a low point in the entire genre with its sequel, yeah, it's just too harsh of a fall-off to be ignored. So, this is Combat Overview. Here we go over the general controls, the main mechanics, who or what we use them on, and then seeing how it all comes together. Hey, Rebellion makes its debut here. Not bad, not bad. But that's where the good ends. So our sword doesn't work quite like how it used to. There's no longer delays to get different enders. Instead, we have directional inputs mid-combo to get branching outcomes. It doesn't matter which direction, just move the left thumbstick anywhere after a certain amount of attacks. Well, they're all the same pretty much. Some sort of crowd control kind of attack. And if you notice, none of them are million stab or those quick upward attacks from one, which kinda sucks. Okay, the mess doesn't stop here. Once we lock on, we get to use our original directional attacks. But Stinger is a shadow of its former self. We can't even upgrade to improve it in any way either, so we're stuck with it. High time is still the same, more or less. Got our tap and held versions, can be comboed into, and so on. Neat thing is, they added an air combo with these kick attacks. Gotta hold lock on to do these because if not, it'll do the classic combo splitter instead. So we're given more combos than one, but none of this matters. You won't think about enders for their unique properties. You won't use Stinger or High Time to reposition enemies. Instead, you'll just mash out your basic combo over and over and over, because it's all you need to do. There's no counterplay from enemies to challenge you or get you to rethink your approach in any way. So you can do this for free and be more than fine. And oh yeah, no more slash cancels either, but it doesn't look like we need them anyways. Now we get new weapons throughout the game. They're all swords, but their descriptions say they have little differences, but it doesn't really look or feel like that's true, and that's because they seem to attack at the same speed and have the same range too. They even have the exact same move list as one another. This 3-weapon system is nowhere near as good as Onimusha Warlords, and of course they aren't as varied like DMC1 either. Instead, we just get copy and pasted weapons, so just stick with Rebellion and you'll be fine. Not as if we can swap weapons during a fight as it is anyways, like we could in the first game. And another thing, it's not just your basic attacks that feel very sluggish, because I noticed that whenever you land from any sort of airborne state, it takes some time before we can get moving again. There's a bit of momentum, it feels like. And when compared to DMC1, yeah, all of this adds up. This is some Kingdom Hearts 3 RE4 remake levels of bad. Every bit of movement or attack we do is just so delayed and unresponsive, which is a pretty big no-no in our arcade action games. Now the most common complaint about this game is just how powerful your guns are. Thing is though, they've always been super strong. We even had cancel tech to dish out even more damage than intended. So to me this isn't enough to instantly damn this game for good. It has to be deeper than that. Well, first let's just see what we can do with our guns. You can do the standard juggle extensions, but there's twosome time, hitting multiple enemies at once. And during a double jump we have this rainstorm. You can even swap weapons on the fly now too. But it's not worth doing any of these really. Just standing your ground firing away will do everything you need. It'll completely stop enemies, deals really solid damage, and will launch too. So it's doing multiple jobs at once with no extra inputs on your end. And later enemies won't even find ways to stop this sort of thing like how DMC1 enemies would, so pistols it is. We get a shotgun too, no sidestep cancels, and I never really used it, because you know why? We also get a rocket launcher, no dodge cancels, and I never used it because you know why. So the problem isn't entirely on the guns, it's because of the enemies. They don't fight back or create unique interactions, they don't chase you down or block or dodge, they don't even have critical attacks, so there's no calculated plays for you to go for. The guns had clear strengths and weaknesses against specific enemies in the first game, so even though there was powerful tech, it didn't work on everything. And that's because enemies were well designed not to be solved by one specific subweapon. So this pushed you to experiment with the other options and apply them in interesting ways that other guns just didn't do. This made every gun viable and pretty interesting. But that's completely gone here, making encounters all too easy and repetitive. Again, that's because of bad enemy design, not guns. Onto defenses, we get this new dedicated dodge button. Before we could only roll left to right, but now we have more options. No cancels on reaction though, but it's not like enemies are much of a threat in this game. But yeah, not only that, but we can use this to run up and on the side of walls. You know what? This is starting to remind me of Death by Degrees a lot. It tries to pull off this whole acrobatic stuff. Both don't really pull it off too well. Then there's this whole lock-on kind of thing to get different attacks, which are also hit or miss. They use a thumbstick more often for different attacks. Yeah, it's pretty strange how close they are, but whatever they're trying to do, it didn't work out. Either way, jump cancels aren't here either, and I'm not sure if there's iframes or not. Clash parries are gone too, but again, we fight nothing enemies, so it doesn't seem like we really need it. Looking at the HUD, you got a health, and our DT is a bit more readable since it's just a straightforward meter this time. And the usual stuff, it gradually heals you, get hyper armor, and buffs damage on everything, especially guns. But we do get even more enders while in DT. This is where Million Stab is at, and some other new attacks, but again, these won't need much thought from you. You're most likely going to be firing away instead. There is some cool ideas here, but since they're in this game, it won't be used to the fullest. Yeah, we have a customizable DT with these amulets. Just little passives, but nothing too major since, you know. There's also something called Majin DT. You need to be in critical low health for it to show up. Could be a cool comeback mechanic, but since we're playing DMC2, it's going to be really rare to see since nothing really puts up a fight. So you have to go out of your way to see this. Also, taunting has been completely removed, so yeah. Upgrades. We can up our damage on guns and swords, but as you notice, there's no new moves to buy because we have all of them at the start. We already start with Air Hike unlocked, as well as Stinger. Only was good though. But yeah, since there isn't any moves to buy, it kind of reminded me of beat 'em ups. We're given our entire move list at the start, and it's up to us to master as we play. Not a bad idea, honestly. The thing is, our attacks have no purpose, and enemies don't require different tactics, so mash away. Secret missions are pretty bad here too, because they're just flat battle arenas. This sort of mission type can work, but since enemies are so terrible, these have no impact. And they're all alike too. Compared to DMC1, how it'll teach you unique mechanics like the critical attacks. But here it's more what the regular game has to offer, rather than ask you to find the strategy to this very different scenario we wouldn't have seen otherwise. So, they're pretty bland. When it comes to enemies, they're bad. There's little goblins, I guess, and skeletons. They don't make you do anything different. They might as well be the same enemy type. And I gotta say, these names for most of these things are awful. It just seems like they mashed the keyboard and called it a day. Yeah, I know I keep saying this, but these enemies don't do anything. They don't push you in any way, and the entire game is solved within minutes. Just mash your one combo over and over, do this until you get DT, just to melt everything with the guns. So if the enemies are undercooked, you can only imagine how bad the bosses can be. Let's just start with the infamous skyscraper boss. The first phase is extremely simple, but you know what? Phase 2 is the closest we can get to some kind of DMC1 boss, because it actually tosses out some projectiles to keep us moving, kind of like Griffin. Then they'll switch up to a shotgun-like attack, so we gotta reposition around it. It actually gets us to think a tiny bit and have an alright back and forth. See, this is what I mean. Having us use guns isn't horrible on its own, because DMC did this a whole lot as well, and those bosses were pretty great. It's really all on the fact that we need opponents that fight back. That's why Infested Chopper is as much of a joke as it is, because it doesn't do anything. The strategy is no different than basic enemies, and we're given no reason to respect their attacks, so it comes off as one note. Again, guns alone isn't why this game is bad, it's enemy design. As we go on, we're going to go up against a poison and fire boss. These early bosses really set the mood going forward, because all their attacks are mainly up close, which means there's no attacks to challenge your passive positioning. So if we only get attacked when we're up close, well, let's just stay back the entire time and fire away. The game is more than happy to let that fly. Now this might be the only good boss in the entire game. So it starts off simple enough, and toss out this ball at you, so you gotta roll around it or jump over to get in a few hits. It's a very classic pattern. But once you do enough damage, the game starts to add lasers. So now you've got to constantly stay on the move, avoiding all these new hazards, all while pushing your advantage when you can. It has a nice ramp up and challenge to its concept. Actually really make an enjoyable fight because of that. But let's just immediately throw that all away, because we fight the one and only Phantom again. Oh no, remember how well designed he was in 1? Yeah, it takes a few seconds to really put everything into perspective, just how off the mark 2 is. It's the exact same feeling I got playing Dark Side in Kingdom Hearts 3, just showing how little they knew what the strengths were in the previous games. So yeah, then we fight these 3 heads, each having their own projectile based attack. Even the heads will get in close with their own attacks. Honestly, I can imagine seeing something like this in DMC1. It's not like projectile heavy bosses weren't a thing, right? But man, this one is just so damn slow. It's because you can only damage the red one, which means most times you gotta just stand around. You can fire away if you want, but it'll basically do no damage. You need to wait for them to combine, which can take a while. Then it's your turn. Yeah, this sort of boss was done pretty well in Cuphead. Gotta look out for their tells so you can position in time. And most importantly, each one can actually take damage. But with how it's done here, yeah, it's pretty bad. We're gonna fight these clone sisters later on. They're a joke, especially when compared to something like Daughters of the Coup. And that's because they don't fight at all. I just mash my basic combo over and over, and it works. Then we fight Arius. Now this is the perfect boss to represent this entire game. And that's because he just looks so unfinished. Just kind of stands around and waits for you to hit him. Rarely reacts to what you're doing. Maybe tosses out an attack or two, but nothing to worry about. Yeah, it's just nothing. Mash away and win. And then there's Discount Nightmare. Same sort of idea. Depending where you are, it'll have different attacks. Get to see some callbacks to one, which is pretty cool. But man, there's some easy to find dead zones in their patterns, so you'll be able to fire away for free with no hassle. For Dante's final boss, it's the same thing. Shoot away. And if you get through Lucia's story, she gets to take on the true final boss. Which there's not much to say about either of those phases because it's just the same old same old. Yeah, there's nothing here. There's no unique interactions between enemies and bosses like in one. No critical kills or fun gimmicks to these bosses. It's all so bland and stale. Kinda like this game. And that's DMC2. There's quite a bit to unpack here. While the atmosphere of 1 is completely gone, we're no longer exploring cryptic castles, but now we're in this big city. While in general we're given more spacious, wide open areas most times, it's different for sure from what the first game established. This could be fine, but there's nothing for us to do in here, and they don't use this area to give us great fights. So you'll just find some easy enemies and then you're back on your way. Really reminded me of Berserk's long stretches of empty hallways fighting nothing enemies. I do appreciate how they mix up the visuals of the locales at least. They even add some traps or platforming to mix things up, but nothing matches the gothic look of the first game. Well, the cool thing is there's an entire extra story for Lucia. It's mostly the same, minus a few missions and then 2 or 3 new ones just for her. But it's a neat companion mode to see her side of things. Could be cool, in theory, right? Basically Ada Wong's separate ways or Claire's scenarios. Revisiting the same levels, having to relearn how to approach all these enemies and bosses with a totally different toolset. Pretty similar to beat 'em ups in that way, having to figure out her strengths and weaknesses to create different strategies. To me, this idea could have been awesome, but since enemies and bosses are no threat whatsoever, it makes this whole idea pretty worthless. But if you're crazy enough to beat both of their stories on hard mode, you'll unlock Trish, or use the built-in cheat codes like I did to get her early. Honestly, if you ever want to play this game at least one time, I'd recommend you do the same. Especially if you're fresh off your DMC1 run because she has Dante's move list with some of her own unique attacks. So yeah, she's easily the most enjoyable out of the 3. But yeah, this still isn't enough to save this game. Why is that though? We have more options, more combos, and more characters than before. One of them being Trish, having a playstyle similar to Dante's. But why doesn't all that automatically match or even surpass the first game? Well, it's because large move lists alone don't make a great action game. The majority of that responsibility lies entirely on enemy and boss design. That's the major difference between these 2 games. Enemies were the backbone of DMC1's combat. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to pull off some thoughtful plays, because those enemies actually challenged us and made us respect the options, and that got us to rethink our approach and form new strategies. So when we see this nosedive in quality with 2's enemies design, notice how bad the game got. All the extra combos, aerial attacks, and added movement options couldn't salvage it. I know the general thought or consensus is that if there's juggles and combos, then it must mean it's a good action game, right? No, it's enemies and bosses. I know I keep repeating this point, but I can't emphasize enough that what we fight is the most important aspect to make a great action game. And that's the main takeaway I want us to have with this one. So it wasn't because of the guns that made this game combat so bad, it's because the enemies don't force any reaction out of you. They don't guard, dodge, rush you down. In general, they don't test your mastery of its mechanics or make you rethink your strategy, which means those sort of on-the-fly adaptations just never happen. And that right there is truly what makes or breaks a good action game. You could have all the options in the world, but there will be no point in using any of those attacks or extra mobility if all the enemies just let us mash whatever we want. But attacks and movement are slow and sluggish, there's no weapon variety with unique uses, enemies and bosses are stand-ins. It's obvious this game is heavily flawed, removing all new ones from the first game in the process. But you gotta admit, despite the rocky development, they found a way to sprinkle in some neat ideas. So we gotta give them props where it's due. Gave us Rebellion, get a little early look at what styles could be. The amount of content isn't half bad, with 2 characters with their own story, and an unlockable one on top of that. Bloody Palace makes its debut, building off Onimusha's Dark Realms. Mission Select is a thing now too. Yeah, all of this in any other game would be awesome to have, but it goes down the gutter because the game is just undercooked and too easy, and we already went over why. Oh, and one last thing, I have no clue what people see in this outfit, because it looks pretty bad. It's either a motorcycle jacket with the stretched out coattails, or they ripped the front off a leather jacket and had it slapped on top. It actually looks like a tuxedo vest just worn over a trench coat. Yeah, you can tell me what I'm missing, but honestly, I get the feeling people like it so much because it's what they were told for so long. Because what else is there to say about this game, right? Yeah, anyways, don't really know how to end this, so let's just get ourselves prepped for DMC3 already.